Hi, this is Mr. Elon. If you're watching this video, it's because you are choosing the Pokemon option for the layer menu project. Whichever option you choose, this unit is all about learning the layer menu and learning basic photo compositing in Photoshop. There are some mild differences between the two projects, and the Pokemon one is maybe a little more painterly versus the rap album cover option, which is a lot more like graphic design. Either way, though, you're learning the layer menu and you're learning to get different elements to work together physically within the same space and make sense visually together. If you're picking the Pokemon version, it's important to note the word photorealistic. Photorealistic means, especially if you're adapting something, here's some examples from the internet, where we have these like cartoon characters who have been depicted photorealistically. Using photographic assets. So that's why we look at Mario here and we see like the pores on his skin and things like that if we get in closer. So in other words, you are going to reconstruct a Pokemon, and I'll kind of blow through some examples here. You're going to reconstruct a Pokemon that you pick that can be constructed from at least 3 different assets, often an animal and then parts of 2 other animals, and then there usually will be some other tool manipulation that you have to go through too. We'll look at some quick student examples. Most of those were from the internet. These are all student examples. I think this one was in the last pile too. Here's one of Mewtwo, and it's worth noting that this Mewtwo is terrifying looking, which is appropriate for the character if you know the character. That is a question that you might want to ask yourself pretty early on. Do I want it to be, scary, fearsome? Do I want it to be somewhere in between where it looks like, a wild animal but isn't necessarily scary looking? Or do I want it to just be cute? And the best strategies for just making it cute basically have to do with getting it to sort of mimic the proportions of a baby. So for instance, if I put this Mewtwo into Photoshop and I go in, and this is just going to be really quick and crude, but if I go in and I select its head, a baby's head is going to be bigger on its body than its other, than an adult's would. So if I select its head, and then resize it so it's big. That might be going a little overboard, but yeah, so if I resize it so that it's big, and then especially if I go in with the eyes and resize those. All of a sudden, in spite of how, gross the textures are of this like alien corpse looking thing, all of a sudden it does get significantly cuter. So it's a pretty simple strategy. I bring it up only to say, I'm not saying I would cuddle with this thing, but it is cuter than it was when I first opened it. So that's not to say that you have to be cute or that you have to be scary, but sometimes people are disappointed when they're going for one and they accidentally achieve the other. So, those are the biggest things. And if you're going for scary, the reverse of what I just showed, along with some texture, some, sharpness, stuff like that. To start, you got to pick a Pokemon. And usually I think the handout has a suggestion of kind of a dated website. Usually if you just Google the word Pokedex, which is the in-universe term for your stack of Pokemon. And then scroll around on this, get that out of the way. This first website, which is actually by the Pokemon Company, has all sorts of Pokemon on it. And you want to pick one, once again, that you could kind of conceive of constructing a certain way. Some of them might be so abstract, like this one. Probably you would start with a pea pod, but as far as like constructing all those other things, you'd have to get wildly creative. So certainly if you're up for a challenge, you might pick one that at first glance you have no idea what you would even base it on. what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't pick a Pokemon. Let me load some more here. I wouldn't pick a Pokemon that seems like it's just going to be like this one. Kind of just looks like it's a snake. Yeah, you'd have to recolor it and maybe distort some of the features, but there isn't really much more to it than that. It's not going to be all that interesting and might be kind of contrived if you're just like following the rules of the assignment. It might just look sort of silly to like add things onto it. Versus a lot of these other ones that are pretty easy to look at and conceive of ways that you might say, okay, I'm going to take this lizard and add this other lizard's head and then add fire for the tail, or I'm going to use a bat's wings in this lizard's body and so on, or I'm going to use, sometimes it's not even an animal. I'm going to use a tortoise. I'm going to use the head of a pointier lizard with notable ears, or, get ears from somewhere else like a cat or something, although you do want to be aware of textures. And then, of course, you're going to have to come up with like some kind of canon thing to like add to the shell. So, once you have picked your Pokemon and you have kind of figured out a strategy for combining its pieces together, you're going to start searching for those pieces on Google. At this point, I'm going to go to Google Images, and I'm just going to search turtle. And, of course, I can kind of scroll around and look for a turtle, but there are a few things you're going to want to do before you do anything else. The first is I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to pick Size Large. That is very important. Now, that does mean some of the potential assets have gone away, but that also means that any of these assets is usable in terms of resolution. There are some other things you might do. One of them is if I go to Type, I might change it to Photo. That doesn't really change anything here, but sometimes you'll get like weird little cartoon characters and things like that, and you really don't want that. Or in other words, here are the assets I use for mine. If I open up these eyes right here, these eyes are never going to work. They're just never going to photorealistically sync in with anything that's around. So whichever version of the assignment you're picking, you want to make sure that all of your assets are photographic, or if they're not photographic, they're highly photorealistic, including texture, light and shadow, color, and everything. The other thing that you might do, and I will tell you that for this assignment, which is kind of maybe somewhere in between an artwork and an exercise. We'll spend about a week on it. But you might be changing usage rights to labeled for reuse with modification. I would say it's a good idea to be in the habit of doing that. That's going to limit your options, but it also means that anything that you see, you can work with. And that's very different from not picking labeled for use with modification. Finding yourself in a situation where you have created this masterwork, but you've created it based on someone else's photograph. You get paid for your work, or you win an award or something, and then the original photographer, expects you to pay up and maybe isn't particularly nice about it, which, they don't have to be. You stole their stuff. For this assignment, you might be in the habit of at least starting there, and if you're not finding what you want, you could just change back to not filtered, because with this assignment, it's not the biggest deal. With the next assignment, it is required. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's a good idea to be in the habit of using things that are there for you to use. Not every photographer who is posting their stuff to the internet wants you to just take it and do whatever you want with it. The only other thing I should mention is anything that you're thinking of using, you're going to save. So I might be looking up a turtle. I might be looking up a background that I'm going to put that turtle onto. And I might be looking up, at least two other animals or parts of animals or other things like cannons to add on to it. So everything needs to be nice and big. Everything needs to be a photograph, and it's a good thing if it's labeled for reuse with modification under usage rights. At any rate, if I really like this turtle and I want to work with it, the most important thing about saving it is I do not save from here. If it's a teeny picture on the screen, you're probably saving a teeny picture. You're saving a thumbnail. Therefore, even though I did large, it's going to be a low resolution picture. So if I click this, it comes up nice and big, and sometimes it's going to come up even bigger if I click again, and then just kind of keep clicking until it gets as big on the screen as possible, at which point I may right click and hit Save Image As. That's as far as where you save. I'm not on a school computer right now, so I can't do this, but I would be saving in your student login drive. So you should know what that is from class. If not, make sure you ask. That way you're not saving locally to the computer, and you're saving to a file that you can access from any other computer. I would not be putting stuff into your Google Drive because you're going to just have to download it to be able to work with it anyway. Okay. As far as this is the same handout from the last project, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and I'll put it on multiply. That way I can kind of highlight things. I'll be highlighting in purple. There isn't a whole lot that I'm going to need to highlight that's different from the other project. There are a lot of things that you used on the other project, like the lasso tool, making a selection and refining the edge, and changing brightness, contrast, hue, saturation, color balance, all that stuff. A lot of that stuff you're going to do on this project too. So the big things that are new are the move tool, the eraser tool, and then the entirety of the layer menu. That is the biggest thing about this project, is you are learning the layer menu. The layer menu, there's kind of a lot to it. We'll kind of see all of this as we go through it, but almost everything on here is relevant to whichever version of the project you're doing. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and first I'm going to open this. This is the Pokemon that I picked. The Pokemon's name is Panpour. Excuse me. He's a little water monkey. And in fact, I think in this iteration it's Hayabu. I don't know if that's like an old name or a Japanese name, but anyway, I know in modern versions he's named Panpour. I find him kind of cute, but I ended up not necessarily going for cute in my version. It is worth noting, especially if you're kind of looking at like an old illustration, that there are going to be some things that are open to interpretation. In this case, this to me, because especially knowing it's a water type Pokemon, this looks like a spout of water, but then it sort of manifested itself in this frozen physical form. Therefore, I don't know that a spout of water would really make sense visually. So I just kind of went for something that I thought looked similar, and you'll see that in just a second. And it's kind of a weird choice. I wouldn't try to be intentionally weird and obtuse, but if you make some weird choices and they end up working out, then so be it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up my version, and like I said, my version is a little scary. Here it is in the water. It's got kind of like elongated features. And again, if I wanted it to be cuter, I could just make the head and the eyes bigger and I'd be okay. I'm not going to do absolutely everything that you see here. Some of that stuff would just be redundant to, have me make you watch me like coloring everything. I'll do a little of that just for review's sake. But I want to show the basics of like getting things to work together. Now, if you look over at my layer menu, which is in the bottom right-hand corner here, there's kind of a lot going on, and there are some layers that are turned off, so that's kind of the first thing. You probably already know from just doing that alphabet homework and like putting the letters together that anytime you add something, it becomes its own layer. The same is true if you copy something. Basically, the construction of this was a series of taking assets like this monkey and this broccoli and, whatever else, and compositing them together, selecting from one image and moving it to the other. I have a few assets that I didn't use. I initially thought I might have a Pokeball, worked into the frame somehow, and I didn't end up using that. So when you're starting to gather your assets, it's a good idea to just get more than you think you're going to need, and then use what you end up using. What I'm going to do for now, you've seen kind of the end result, and I'm going to just kind of turn off all of this stuff except for the background layer. And then there was like an alternative background that I had that I didn't like as well. So I'm turning off everything except the background layer, and I'm going to go ahead and open this monkey so I can get it on there. Now, to open it, first of all, it's worth noting that you do not want to open things like this. If you open it and there's a big X through it, you've opened it as a smart object, and you've opened it in the same file. And it's better for the way we do things to open things as a tab. So I hit enter. I can just throw this in the garbage. Smart objects are good for certain reasons, but we're not going to get into that right now. It takes some explaining. For our purposes, to keep things simple, when I open, I can either just do it through File Open up here, or if I am dragging it in, I'm going to drag it not to here, but to my tab bar. Oddly enough, it says move, and it doesn't actually move the file. It just opens it as its own tab. All right, and in here, I am going to make a selection of my monkey. So I'm going to start with the Quick Select tool, and I'm going to start swathing it over, and it's going to do a pretty good job since the monkey is in a colorful environment, but the monkey itself is kind of grayish. That's a good reason to use the Quick Select tool. It's not doing a perfect job, though. If you can see that dotted line, you can probably see it's like popping out wildly from the monkey. But once again, if I just kind of combine it with Alt, in other words, I got more than I wanted, so I'm holding Alt now. I might even kind of shrink the brush size a little. I know some of this is probably a little hard to see in the video, but the point is to just cultivate as accurate of a selection as possible. It is worth noting, and I'll be talking a little bit while I'm perfecting my selection, which I may not, necessarily do. I expect to see perfect selections in your case. I'll do what I reasonably can in a reasonable amount of time in this video, but I do expect to see perfect selections in your case. We don't want yucky, jagged, digital-looking edges, extra artifacts, or missing pieces. It is worth noting, however, that extra parts are an easy fix, but missing pieces are not, especially when you start resizing and manipulating your asset that you've selected. Oh, missed the eye there. If you have missing pieces, you might as well just reselect the whole thing and start back over from square one. If you have extra pieces, if you have too much, then it's pretty easy to take it off using the eraser tool, which you'll probably see at some point. Okay, this is a reasonably decent selection. Now you'll notice that my monkey has a little problem. The leaf is kind of, cutting into its rear end there. So to fix that, I am going to use the clone stamp tool, and I'll worry about that once it's over on my actual picture. It doesn't look like I'm missing, maybe a little bit right there. Okay, it doesn't look like I'm missing anything, so I'm just going to say that's a pretty successful selection, and I'm going to roll with it. Now, I did say at the beginning that you're going to want to highlight the Move tool. The Move tool is at the top of the toolbar. And if I ask you to guess what it does and you say it moves things, you'd be right. But it's worth noting that the Move tool is the only way to move things. So if I pick the Move tool, I can grab my monkey, I can click and hold, I can have a little puppet show, and there he is. But if I'm not using the Move tool, in fact, I'll back off that. If I'm still on my Quick Select tool and I try to grab it and move it, it's just gonna add or subtract from the selection. Same is true if I'm on the lasso tool and I lassoed all this. I'm gonna cut this little part off. Yeah. Sorry, my cats. Get out of here, kitty. Yeah, if I try to move it with this, it's just going to move the selection, which I definitely don't want. So I'll back off once again using history. So I go up to the Move tool, and at this point you may again remember this from the alphabet thing. If I grab this tab and pull it away and let it kind of float out here and then drop it, now I can grab my monkey, I can puppet it around, and then I can move over this way, and it looks like it's not going to move. It does this weird little thing where a box appears, and my otherwise black arrow turns into this white arrow with a plus sign. But if I let go, bloop, it drops the monkey on there. So I'm going to just redock this. Now, it is worth noting, if I go over to this tab, this is kind of a small asset. And in general, I'm going to go ahead and do this, but this might be small enough that I might reconsider it. I'm going to roll with it just for demonstration purposes. But if you drag something in and it pops in super small, that either means that your background is a ridiculously large resolution, which, you know, maybe isn't a problem. But it might also mean that your asset, the thing you're adding to the background, is ridiculously small, and therefore you might find another asset, or it could mean that you saved the asset wrong. But remember, the higher the resolution, the better, always. I'm going to go ahead and resize my monkey, and I can do that using, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. I can do that using CTRL-T. It's also worth noting, I'm going to take the opacity up a little here. It's also worth noting that, there we go. That's maybe a bit much, but that's okay. It's also worth noting that when you hit Control-T, you're also going to have to hit Enter to complete a transformation. I showed that in one of the other videos, but I'm going to re-highlight it here. If I go back to here and I hit, I'm going to put it back to the Move tool, and I hit Control-T, you're going to notice that when I grab this and pull on it, it's very easy to distort my monkey to make it ridiculously wide or ridiculously skinny, and I don't want either of those things, which is why anytime you are transforming, you want to hold Shift. Shift will lock the proportions in place so it doesn't get skinny or fat. That is a really easy way to lose points, but it's also a really easy thing to remember and not lose points. So make sure you're always holding Shift while you're transforming. At this point, I am going to pop out from my transformation box. You see how the arrow turns into a curvy arrow? I'll tilt him just the littlest bit, and I'm going to hit Enter. And once again, that completes the transformation. And I actually don't need this anymore. I feel like my selection is adequate. One thing I didn't do with it, which isn't, you know, the biggest deal on in this case, but one thing I didn't do is I didn't hit Refine Edge. So remember, you hit Refine Edge, especially with a higher resolution thing, you're going to see that like hard digital edge. So adding a little feather to it, especially if it's a furry thing like this, is a good idea. But you don't want to go overboard. You do not want your selections to look too furry. And you can always, and I'll show you a trick here. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to go in with the eraser. Because the monkey is on its own layer, I can use the eraser to erase off some of this leaf that I didn't end up needing. I can also use it to, number one, since the eraser has a hazy edge, the hardness is down, I can use this eraser to just kind of like shave off some stuff, or in general just make the edge of it seem a little more feathered. So anywhere where I'm seeing that green from the leaves, kind of look like a green screen a little bit, I can soften that edge using the eraser, something like that. Okay, real quick, I'm going to use the clone stamp tool in quick review. To use it, I'm going to hold Alt and click, and then I'm going to move and color. And it might take me a couple passes with a couple different target selections. And get rid of that little part, and that should be perfectly fine. Again, I don't always perfect things, so I'd probably do a little more with it to get rid of that indent. I'm not going to worry about it or make you watch me do it. While I'm in here, I am going to go ahead and look at coloring some of it. I'm just going to worry about coloring its head. So it does have this like muzzle area that's kind of tan. If I go over to my monkey and make a selection, one thing that may surprise you is I'm going to start the selection here at the corner of its ear. And I'm going to kind of work it all the way around like this. Very carefully. And then out here, I'm just going to go brrr and not really worry about it. And here's why. Sometimes I'll see people, you know, they've got the whole monkey in its own layer, and I'll see they want to move the monkey, so they start selecting the monkey. You don't need to do that. In fact, I'll just temporarily deselect and just demonstrate. If I change my mind about the position of the monkey, I just grab the monkey and move it. As long as I'm on that layer, I can move it. So I'm going to back up to before I deselected. But the fact is, it's a monkey that is, other than the background, it's just like floating in this void. That checkerboard stuff means there's nothing there. And therefore, the selection that I just put on this, you might worry about it, like, I'm going to turn the head blue. Is it going to turn the background blue? And the answer is no. It's not going to turn the background blue because there's nothing there and I'm not on the background layer. So I'm going to go Image Adjustments and Color Balance. And I'm going to just kind of start turning it blue. It's worth noting that I would probably want to do this to the whole thing at once. All of it that should be blue, I would change it to blue. Now I might kind of go to shadows and like change that to blue, especially cyan, I think is relevant to the color of that critter. Highlights, shadows, and so on. Now it is getting pretty monochromatic, that might be a reason for me, and I'm not going to worry about it, but I'll just hit OK. That might be a reason for me, for instance, before doing any of that, to like hold Alt and like get the eyes out of it. And that way they don't turn super blue as well. Now, and actually I think I will go ahead and do that because I didn't refine the edge. So I've got my lasso here. I'm going to hit Refine Edge. I don't want the bottom of this to look all digital, so I'll pull the feather up, hit OK, and I might as well, just so you can kind of see the difference. I'm going to select the eyes out of it, and actually I kind of think that the monkey's kind of muzzle area, I got to kind of double check that, so it kind of goes up that way. I'm going to just go ahead and go like this, and just eliminate that whole muzzle area from the equation. Something like that. All right, and now I'll refine edge. That looks pretty scary. And soften everything. Hit OK. And now I'll do that same thing. Image adjustments, color balance. Lots of cyan, a little bit of blue on the midtones. Shadows, maybe a little blue, lots of cyan. Highlights, lots of cyan, maybe just a little cyan. I think that looks, pretty solid. Maybe a little blue. All right, and then I probably would want to exaggerate the tan quality of the monkey's, muzzle here. So I'm going to go like that. I'm going to hit Refine Edge, pull feather up, hit OK, and then Image Adjustments, Color Balance, and for tan, what I might do is I might kind of make it like significantly orange. But if I don't like where that's going, I can always go to hue-saturation and take saturation down some to get it to feel nice and tan. Okay. So again, I'm not doing the rest of the body looks like very gray in comparison now, especially. I'm not going to worry about the rest of the body. Now, I am going to go ahead and mess with the ears. It is worth noting that it would probably be a good idea for me to just find a separate asset of monkey ears that's nice and high resolution, since it's pretty clear that those ears need to get gigantic. They probably also need like a slight variance in color, so I might even begin by just selecting the outer area of the ear and refining the edge. And then maybe I use brightness contrast, at least at first, to kind of get that to be a little darker. And then maybe I'll go for a little more blue and a little less cyan in my color balance. Blue, blue, blue. Little, I don't want to turn it purple. I'll just leave the cyan as it is. Blue, blue. So I might kind of push it super far. That looks a little too brightly colored. But if I go in with saturation and pull saturation out of it, it should look pretty good. Okay. What I'm going to do in this case, just to speed things along rather than gathering a different ear, is I'm going to go ahead and select this ear. And I'll refine the edge once again. Feather up just a little ways. And then I'm going to go Edit, Copy, and Edit, Paste. On your handout, you probably already have Edit highlighted. There isn't a specific thing that talks about like copying and pasting, but it does say changes basic quality. So, that's something that you might often find in any program that involves creating something. You will often find that there's an edit menu, or you might also, there are keystrokes here. So Control-C and Control-V will do the same thing. You don't have to actually do it through the menu. Okay, now, it doesn't look like anything happened, but when I did that, it made an extra ear. And if I go in with my move tool and kind of notice right here, there's a little tiny dot in this new layer, layer 9. If I grab it and move it, there's this ear that just happened to be lined up with the other ear when I copied and pasted it. At this point, I'm going to go Control-T, which once again is free transform. I am holding Shift so I don't get it like super skinny or super fat. But you will notice that the resolution gets a little dumpy when I make it like extra big. So just be aware of that. That's why I said earlier it's probably better for me to use a separate asset of an ear that's higher resolution so it doesn't look all blurry and blocky. I hit enter. It will sharpen up a little bit because as you're transforming, it gives you kind of a preview grid, not full resolution. Now, it stands to reason that if this monkey's ear is this big, its other ear is not only also this big, but you should be able to see it kind of popping up out of the side of the head. In order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer. It is worth noting that anytime you are told you have a minimum number of layers that have to be involved with a project, duplicate layers don't count toward the total. They're encouraged if they are useful or needed or they're going to look cool, but they're not going to count toward the total. So, in other words, if I have a Pokemon with 9 tails, for instance, duplicating one tail 9 times by copying the layer, even though you're slightly manipulating it, isn't going to count toward your total. Fortunately, you don't need 9 layers if you're picking the Pokemon version. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click in the layer menu on this layer, and I'm going to hit Duplicate Layer, and I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to take the Move tool, and I'm going to move this other ear right over here. Now, that doesn't look right, because first of all, it needs to be flipped. That's pretty easy. Now, if I go into Image, there's Image Rotation, and there's this flip stuff here. That's not going to work. That's going to flip the entire image. It says Flip Canvas, Flip Canvas. We don't want to flip the canvas. We just want to flip this particular ear. So I'm going to do that through Edit Transform. If I jump down, Edit Transform, and then Flip Horizontal, bloop, it flips. Now, if I try to position it, I either make it look like it's like too far from the head and it's being pulled on, or it's like stuck to the side of the face or something. The easy fix for that is to change the order in the layer menu, which is talked about on your handout down here. So you can change order by just dragging and pulling things around. The layer menu is an ordered series of images that are sort of stacked on top of one another, and the bottom corresponds with the back. So the lower down something is, the further behind other things it's going to be. In other words, if my monkey is layer 8 here, and I can actually just, rename this monkey, not money. And this is the first ear and this is the second ear. I'm not going to worry about labeling those. But if I grab my left ear, it's right, my left, and pull it underneath the monkey layer, just by grabbing that layer and pulling on it, and drop it, it goes behind. The only other thing I might consider doing once I get it positioned is I might actually consider breaking my own rule this once, hitting Control-T, and resizing this without actually holding Shift. I'm actually making it skinnier, and I'm doing that so that it kind of appears to be angled back at a similar angle as this one. So that's only going to work with assets that are relatively flat, like an ear. Something, like a basketball or something. It's just going to look like it's deflated or it's a cardboard cutout if you try to do that. But fortunately, it works pretty well here. Otherwise, I would need an asset of an ear or a basketball or whatever that was like positioned in a different angle. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to show is how I got that broccoli to work with the top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and open this broccoli asset. And because this broccoli is like a stock image, it's got this white background. Sometimes you might even find a stock image that's a PNG where you don't even have to select it. If it's a PNG, you can just use the move tool and it's already selected essentially. PNG is the only image file type that allows you to have a non-rectangular shape. So even though it'll open in a rectangle, the shape of the actual image is just like this. Unfortunately, this is not a PNG, but that's going to allow me to show you another selection tool, which is called the Magic Wand tool. If you want, you can highlight it on your handout. It is very, very small, so I'll have to zoom in here. It is off to the side of the quick selection tool, which once again simply means that it's hidden underneath it. So here it is, Magic Wand. Magic Wand selects things based on mainly color, value, and contrast, so it's not that different from the quick selection tool. So what I can do here is this. And this is a little trick that's not like explicitly outlined on your handout, but if I go in with the Magic Wand tool and I click the background here, click this white area. Now I have the white selected. I don't have the broccoli selected, but I have the white selected. So if I was trying to select the broccoli directly and I click here, notice that it's selecting only a certain level of green, and that has to do with my tolerance. If I lower my tolerance to, let's say, 1, then it's only going to get like a teeny speck of green, because there are tons of differences in the photographic greens as they, shift and move and get lighter and darker and brighter and duller. If I raise the tolerance, let's say significantly, I raise it to 100, then it's going to get more variations of green, but up here it's still getting confused, and there are little bits of black that are actually kind of part of it that it's not finding. I could always hold shift and try to add to it, but that can still get tedious. So what I'm going to do is deselect, Control D, and then I'm just going to, with the tolerance, I think it defaults to 32, so I'll just go back to that, and I'm going to click the white. Right now, all the white is selected except this part and this part. So I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to click right here. Whoops, need a little more than that, huh? And right here. All right, now everything but my broccoli is selected. However, in my menus up here, File, Edit, Image, Layer, Select, one of them is a Select menu. And if I pull that down, there are several things that are happening here. One is Refine Edge. So if you're ever trying to find the Refine Edge button, but you've already moved on from the selection tool you're on, you can always find it under Select. But the big one I'm looking for is Inverse. Inverse will just turn your selection inside out, meaning right now everything but the broccoli is selected. When I hit Inverse, now the broccoli itself is selected. Once again, I can use the Move tool, grab this tab, pull it away, and then I do want to make sure that I've got this up and ready to go. And then I just grab the broccoli, drag it, drop it, and there it is. Now I'll just go ahead and close this broccoli. I don't need it anymore. So the broccoli layer came in underneath the monkey. I'm going to go ahead and put it over top of everything, really. You'll notice pretty quickly that when I put the broccoli right here, it doesn't look right at all. So first of all, one problem is the broccoli is just sharper than this monkey. Now, if I had used a nice sharp monkey, I wouldn't have anything to worry about. So ideally, again, you want resolutions that are like, high resolution. What I can do, though, to just make sure it matches is I can go in with the blur tool with the strength up pretty high, and I can just blur this broccoli a little bit. That might be a little overboard. I missed a couple spots. But again, ideally you have high resolution images, but sometimes you just gotta get things to work together. Now, the first problem is it's not physically sitting right with what's here. And I'm gonna go ahead and use the eraser tool, which I think at the beginning I did have you highlight. So if I go in with the eraser tool, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of think about the bottom of the shape of this stalk of broccoli and the fact that it probably doesn't like cut off all straight like that. So I'm going to shrink the eraser tool and I'm going to go like this. I'm going to just kind of go like boom, 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 something like that. That way I'm, sort of thinking sometimes it might make more sense to just round out the whole thing, something like that. Now, another thing I can do, the eraser, really any tool that involves brushes, you're going to have different kinds of brushes here. And one of them is this grass brush. I'm going to initiate the grass brush, and I'm going to shrink the size a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of, what the grass brush does is it kind of scatters. So the idea here is it's not necessarily grass, but there is like a hairiness that's happening there. And that grass brush is erasing using that kind of a pattern, like a grassy pattern. It is a little sharp for what I'm trying to do, so I might want to go in with switch it back to like this blurry edged eraser and just kind of make it a little hazier. But the point is to get it to sort of seem like it's coming out from the fur. So you want to be mindful of the edge of the eraser and sometimes the shape or function of the eraser, like the scattering grass brush, when you're trying to figure out how to get something to look like it's like actually happening. So at least it's starting to physically sink in, but it needs to be color matched. In other words, my example here, it looks like it's about the same color. If I try to go in with image adjustments, color balance, I'm going to pretty quickly find that if I nail the color on one part, I've pulled cyan up, I've pulled blue up, up here it's getting close, but down here it's turning into this weird turquoise. And that's because, if I hit cancel, the green up here is very different from the green down here. This is like more of a bluish green, or a solid green. This is a very springy yellow green. So in order to get the whole thing to be the same color, I've got to homogenize it beforehand using saturation. So I pull up hue-saturation, and I pull saturation down, probably rather significantly. Maybe not all the way, but pulling it down is graying out the whole thing, which means it's getting this color and this color to be closer to one another. After doing that, I can then add color back using color balance, and I'm adding it back now to the whole thing, and I'm doing it very consistently. So it might take some time for me to like get it perfect, and I might even need to involve magenta and green. Yeah, I didn't involve that when I was coloring the monkey, but the monkey was a very different color than this thing. I'm not going to, spend too much time like worrying about getting this perfect. Once again, I can mess with tone balance, highlights, and so on. And I may also want to go back in to the hue-saturation thing and get that to work with it too. So at this point, that's probably good. Hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and back out. And that's looking pretty good. The only other things I got to worry about, one of them is shadows. Fortunately, I don't really have much of a sense that shadows would be happening here because it's the water, and the water is wildly moving all over the place. But if your Pokemon is like on like a forest floor or in a desert or something like that, you're going to have to add a shadow to it. If I go ahead and let's say maybe I'll find an asset of a desert. Let me just put desert. Something simple like this. And I'll just quickly copy it in. I'm not actually going to use this, but because I have this unique situation, I will show how to get it to look like it's in the water. That's probably good. And then I'm going to put it underneath all of the stuff that I've done. Now the monkey is kind of floating there. It is worth noting in my layer menu, I can select multiple layers at once. I can't always manipulate multiple layers at once, but I can go hold Control and click multiple layers, and then I can use the move tool, and I can move it out of the way of that thing. So this is a pretty gigantic monkey that I'm putting like right up front. So if I'm going to create a shadow on this monkey, kind of a cast shadow, like casting off. First of all, one way of doing it is if I go to the background layer and just use the burn tool directly on the background. That's good if it makes sense for the shadow to be kind of like blurry and nondescript. So if I start kind of shading underneath it, something like that, that shadow looks a little bit gray. So I'm going to switch the range, switch it over to midtones, something like that. It's a little better. So I am trying to get the shadow to kind of like bend off to the side. I will be the first to admit that this doesn't like quite look right, and it doesn't match the look of the other shadow that's there. But it is better than nothing, and would definitely work in certain situations if the Pokemon were like not in direct sunlight, and you're seeing other shadows in the background that are kind of blurry and nondescript. So I'm going to back off of all of that, and I'm going to show a different way to do a shadow. So I'm on the monkey layer, and I am going to duplicate the monkey layer. Right click, duplicate layer, hit OK. Having duplicated the layer, I have this extra monkey here, and I'm going to put that monkey underneath really everything except for the background. So here it is back here. And I'm kind of pushing it out of the way just so you can see it. Then I'm going to go Image, Adjustments, and hue-saturation, and I'm going to turn it pretty much black, just solid black, and hit OK. Now I'm going to start the process of like radically distorting it. So if I hit CTRL-T, first of all, I might just like tilt it a little bit. And then I'm going to right click on this. Really, maybe I'll just leave it on free transform for a little while, and I'll just start squishing it significantly. And then I'm going to do kind of a series of things. You know, I might try perspective. I might try warp. For now, I'm just going to kind of keep it simple and just do like a lot of warping. And I'm going to pull on this thing really hard, just like ripping it off to the side significantly. So I'm even going off the frame. And I am kind of, one thing that's useful about warp is I can kind of make sure that like the little fingers and feet and whatever, that everything matches up. Things are getting kind of wildly distorted out here, but I could always use clone stamp to like add on if I needed to. I'm not going to worry too much about that. Okay, so my shape isn't perfect, but with just warp, and there are other things besides warp, perspective, distort, you just kind of play with them until it starts looking reasonable as a shape for a shadow on this thing. I can hit enter. I might want to, first of all, in the layer menu, I'm going to go ahead and pull the opacity down. And if I pull it down, it starts looking a heck of a lot more like that shadow that was there. But I can also go in with the eraser. And first of all, if I need to, I can just kind of like reshape the whole thing. You know, I've got some shape that kind of corresponds with the monkey, but I might want to go in here and just say, yeah, this needs to kind of cut away a little bit. Maybe this does too. And then in general, I can use the hazy edged eraser to just kind of fuzz up the edge a little bit. I am going to kind of just get rid of all of this right here and just let that be. Okay, so I can mess with the opacity to varying degrees. If I am finding, you know, for instance, the shadow here looks like it's a different color from this one. So what I might want to do is go into hue-saturation again and pull lightness back up a little ways. And then maybe I add in some color balance. So maybe I'm pulling this toward red a little bit, which is starting to make it look a lot more like that shadow that's there. So that's kind of up to you how you tackle that. But, you know, you can ask me for advice. But yeah, those are kind of the two big ways to create shadows. Now, once again, I don't really need either of these. But I do have a sense that the monkey is not really coinciding with the space. It seems almost as though, you know, when I stick it here, it seems almost as though it is floating above that space. So the last big thing I'm going to show here is how to get it to like integrate with the water. If it were still calm water, I might want to do something similar to the shadow thing that I just did, and then pull the opacity down without actually changing it to black, and that would, and just kind of turn the whole thing upside down using edit, transform, flip vertical. Whoops, dropped my keyboard there. So I'm going to do a really simple thing that I refer to as a bumper, and that'll be the last thing I do here. I'm going to the water layer, my background layer, and I'm going to make a kind of crude big selection. The idea here is that the monkey is kind of digging into the water. So I'm going to make a crude selection of water anywhere where it seems like the monkey's, you know, arms should be disappearing into it. I'm going to refine the edge significantly. Don't worry that it's showing the arms. It's just showing you everything that's happening within that selection. That's probably good. And then I'm going to go edit, copy, and edit, paste, or Control-C and Control-V. So copy, paste. Once again, it doesn't look like anything happened, but if I turn off the background, you see that this layer that's still on is that bumper that I made, that extra little bit of background that just kind of visually aligns with where I selected. So at this point, I'm going to grab that and I'm going to drag it to the very, very top and drop it there. Now, the monkey's kind of disappearing too intensely into it, but there are two things I can do. One would be to take opacity down on this layer. Once again, opacity is the opposite of transparency, so if I take it down, it becomes more transparent. Another thing I could do is just leave this as it is and go in with the eraser tool with the hardness all the way down and the size kind of significantly high, and then I can just start erasing that bumper that I made, and I might even go really high. The higher I go with this, the more space is that hazy edge. So I can really get that to kind of fade and have the monkey's arms kind of disappearing into it and splashing around. Okay, by no means did I finish the Pokemon. You know, I didn't color the rest of the body. I didn't add the other piece of broccoli. I had a totally different piece of broccoli for the tail. But doing that would just kind of be repetitive. So once you are finished with the entire project, you are going to save your work to the turn-in folder. You'll be working on it over the course of several days, so you'll want to have a folder, you know, again, probably your student login folder that you're saving things to. When you're all done, though, you're going to go File, Save As. You're going to find the turn-in folder on the shared drive, and you are going to leave format as Photoshop. That is important, especially with feedback. And especially as we move forward and we have different, we have projects that are more involved with how many layers are in the project. I may very well want to give you some feedback about where you went wrong or what needs to change, and it's helpful and enables me to be more specific if the layers are intact. And that's the big difference between a Photoshop document and, let's say, a JPEG. If you turn this to a JPEG, you're going to flatten all your layers. So don't be in the habit of doing that. The only reason to ever do that is that you're saving your finished work as a copy as a JPEG, maybe so that you could like put it on your phone or something like that, because the Photoshop document is a relatively proprietary file type. It's designed for programs like this that are going to keep those layers separate so you can still manipulate them. I'm not going to save my work, but you get the idea. Good luck. I'll see you in class. Let me know what questions you have.